Um, First of all, my heartfelt thanks to all of you for being here, and a special thank you to the co-chairs that invited me for this keynote. It's a great honor and a pleasure, of course. This little bit of mishap happened with Robert, so I hope that you are not too disappointed if I'm talking today instead. And when I was informed about this by Mushin yesterday night when I arrived here, I tried to rearrange a little bit my presentation that was actually thought to be like fitting well into the second day. So I tried really to make my best effort in order to adjust and to avoid an approach that could have been too narrowed down, and that. So I tried to actually to broaden the approach in order to make it more useful as an introductory keynote today. Thank you for your introduction as well. You said already almost everything about what I do, but I want to tell you a little bit more to give you a little bit of background information. As a graphic artist journalist, I work for The Guardian, and I'm also the deputy graphics editor at The Observer, in a newspaper in London. The Observer is the Sunday paper for The Guardian. But for other organizations, I also employ information design to basically enhance the communicative power and potential impact of visual campaign in the context of advocacy. From this perspective, my work on data visualization and data storytelling could be actually placed at the crossing point, at one of the crossing points of journalism and activism. Many would consider that place as a dangerous one, but I don't think it is, especially if you take on a commitment to truthful and honest reporting and analysis. I have the impression it's going up and down, yeah. I was saying that I wouldn't consider this crossing point between journalism and activism as a dangerous one. I rather consider it as a very fascinating place where data visualization has still a huge potential to achieve for tremendous impacts for change. We should consider that activism is turning to journalism in search of effective visual narratives, often data-based, to boost the message and increase public engagement. On the other hand, quality journalism is increasingly adopting activist strategists, for instance, embracing open digital platform like The Guardian does, where the separation between reader, author, and producer actually shades away. This revolutionary shift from readership to co-authorship has been already recognized as a fundamental element of radical cultural production, and it affects visualization too. But let me give you a brief account of how I ended up doing what I do. In different ways, I've been dealing with data visualization for quite a long time, about 15 years. At the beginning, as a geographer, by studying maps and working with geographic information systems. Later, by researching into the field of data graphically encoded as a powerful tool for analysis and communication. And currently, as I already told, as a graphic artist journalist, by making infographics to visually present information and tell stories through data. Just to give you a bit of background information, even if I am deeply interested in data visualization as a research field right now, and in interactive design too as a practitioner, on a daily basis so far, despite one of my job title include the word graphic artist in particular, I don't build fancy or too innovative visualizations, so don't expect something like that from me. I mostly produce static visual, and I'm quite proud of saying that because everybody now is so fussy about interactive data visualization. I do mostly static visuals that are functional for the reader's understanding and possibly elegant. That's my challenge. So stuff like this, all sort of graphics I use this formula from cricket to genetics, from football to flu pandemic, and from more traditional geopolitical map, slightly French style, to maps including a tiny bit of original solution like this one. So even though I represent here the legacy working class of data visualization, let me indulge with some figurative digression and suggest how we could use a not evidence-based itinerary on grasping the world as a picture in order to understand that there might be a more profound reality behind our fascination with infographics and data visualization. As most of you might have already noticed, I use the term infographics and data visualization in a generously interchangeable way. I do it on purpose. Please bear with me for this gross level of generalization, but before getting started, we need to agree on a definition. Despite most definitions actually stop exactly where they should start instead. But everybody is familiar with infographics, right? Everybody? Yeah. No. Okay. Okay, so I think it's interesting that you know. They are everywhere, by the way, and it's easy to find Flix groups crammed with tons of them. But what do we mean exactly by information graphics? Information graphic is a portmanteau word coming from the contraction of information and graphics, if you use it in English, or informatics and graphics in its French original use. Actually, the Italian one, I'm Italian, by the way, comes from French and was used for the first time in 1991. For me, the term infographics indicates a family of devices for the graphic treatment of information, geographic maps or cartograms, charts of all sorts, diagrams, technical illustrations, and even matrices or tables I include in the family of data visualization. Taken singularly or combined in a composition, infographics can be created basically in different editing contexts, pursue a wide range of analysis and communication goals, apply to endless thematic areas, target different users or audience, use heterogeneous technologies, and especially in relation to their purpose, lead to results of the opposite ends of the quality spectrum. Infographics might have a mission, a serious one or a mundane one. They might have an hidden agenda. They can misrepresent, disinform, or even deceive. They can be used for marketing, fun, or propaganda. They can also be totally pointless or insulting your intelligence, and sometimes not just that. But infographics can also bring to the table analysis and communication strategies meant to engage and transform how and when people consume information, as this brilliant model from Alan McEachern effectively explains by representing the three dimension of visualization in terms of use. Infographics have actually a short past, but a long history, as I am used to say, usually and quite superficially epitomized by this sequence. Sorry, I have to do it, because otherwise it wouldn't be a proper keynote on infographics. So, prehistoric maps, ancient graphics, modern graphics, or William Prefer. You cannot miss this, or Charles Minard. Jon Snow, Florence Nightingale, that has been actually already quoted in the first talk. Otto Neurath, Edward Taft, and of course, The Guardian. Where, by the way, infographics are everywhere, and I mean it literally. But apart from this almost stereotyped narrative, we know the infographics editorial process has gained popularity since the early 60s, when the first graphics informatics system were developed. But it was after 1980, when desktop publishing made its appearance, that it really gathered momentum with computerized vector graphics. Today, the internet and a growing number of web applications for the visualization of data serve as a catalyst, accelerating and highlighting a process that began decades ago. So if the architecture of data presented in graphic form has fascinated you at least once, and I think it happened since you're here, you're already taking part in the unstoppable race towards the production and consumption of infographics that is taking over the contemporary information scene. Is a little bit too emphatic, I understand. But how many times has the spectacular beauty of certain visualization seduced our eye and captured our attention, yet not offered us all the elements we needed to go from a first look infatuation to the intelligent scanning of content. So at the other end of an ideal spectrum of sophistication, we also see the proliferation of infographics with both little informative value and with graphic efficacy. Despite the selection made by the digital ecosystem, which is increasingly competent in infographics, we have to say that, and interlinked with social media that act as curators and distributors of content, the logics that preside over that very selection often remain undefined. So a reflection on the quality criteria, utility and use of infographics therefore seem necessary, if not indispensable. With that purpose in mind, a while ago I found particularly useful to adopt this idea of fetish infographics. And just to avoid any misunderstanding, at that time I wasn't thinking about this. I was rather thinking about this, or this. That example is even more pertinent with the bad resolution of this projector. Because if you try to pull some data out of it, these infographics will actually give you an headache. It's dense, cluttered, and the copy is rendered very tiny, but look like this on purpose, by design. And if you got that headache because you went on reading anyway, despite my warning, you might find useful to discover that it shows more than 200 anti-headache drugs. You can choose from in the average US drugstore, and it highlights also more than 4,000 decisions you might have to make in order to grab the drug that is right for you. Can you just imagine to do a task like that with a headache? Okay, it's very difficult. So when I started using this expression, to me fetish infographics were mainly the result of a flourishing production that favored sensational expression to the expense of intelligibility, making little contribution to the spreading of knowledge. To a certain extent, it was often about data art, disguising itself as informative data visualization, whose final purpose instead should always be leading to some form of understanding. But of course, you can have other purpose in mind when you visualize data, as it happens with generative art, like this one, or data art, like this one. But fetish infographics turn to visual sensationalism and exuberance, seeking to generate aesthetic and emotional experience by giving in to what I call wowification, when you say wow. The overly sophisticated and abstract representation of data that embody the latest example of infographic narcissism. I believe that defining fetish infographics as a data visualization genre were primarily useful to mark this distinction and warning from harmful misalignments of design, audience, aim, and context of publication in data visualization. However, I realized soon that fetish infographics could be defined more broadly by a common and frequently unconscious way of looking at infographics that affects us all. So a little bit of etymology here. Fetish as a noun from the Portuguese feticho means charm, sorcery. As an adjective from Latin factitious means artificial or made by art. Any object eliciting unquestioning reverence or devotion, or something that quite unexpectedly and inexplicably arouses deep interest, respect, and desire in a large number of people can be considered as a fetish. In the conventional sense of the word, fetish refers to a sexual desire that is either amiss or excessive. The condition of who is seduced and mesmerized by fetishes is called fetishism. But behind and beyond the conventional sense, there are three particular meaning and interpretation of fetishism: a Freudian one, a Marxist one, and an ethnographic religious one. The latter involve amorphous gods that are less than idols, can be things, trunks, objects, rocks, animals, to which we ascribe a power named as mana, charm, again, by the ethnologists. In his capital Critique of Political Economy, Karl Marx introduced the idea of commodity fetishism with regard to the perception of the social relationships involved in production. Commodity fetishism turns the subjective, abstract aspects of economic value into objective, real things that people believe have value per se. Nevertheless, the concept of voyeurism and fetishism that we are most familiar with were notoriously formulated in the field of psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud. A Freudian approach considered the spectator experience of visual pleasure in terms of a subjectivity which is shaped in early childhood. In Freudian psychoanalytic theory, an important moment in the shaping of the self is when the child becomes aware of sexual differences and moves away from its early close relationship with his mother. This process of entry into sexuality is what may produce sexual fetishism. Freud's definition of fetishism is derived from older definitions, in which an inanimate object takes on special powers, such as warding off misfortune, and is at the core of religious rituals. In Freud's interpretation, however, an object turns into a fetish when it becomes the focus of sexual desire. The use of Freud's concept of fetishism to explain visual pleasure, it's quite controversial. Because it relies on the theory of male castration anxiety, so that means that feminists wouldn't be very happy with that, rightfully so. Nevertheless, it is useful for thinking about the ways in which certain images are linked to objectification. I'm gonna make it very easy soon, so don't worry too much about this part. The male child develops an unconscious fear of castration at the sight of a woman's body, and fetishism would be one mean of blocking this anxiety. The fetishist suppresses his knowledge of her lack and idealizes objects or body parts associated with the woman. Fetishism, in Freud's interpretation, involved freezing a moment, the moment before the trauma of recognition, and fixating on a fragment. This is very important. On an object or objectified part associated with the woman. So let's talk about visual art, for instance. A photograph works like a fetish because it freezes a fragment of reality. It cuts a piece of space and time and keeps it unchanged while the world around continues to evolve. This visual pleasure or scopophilia is usually understood as an erotic pleasure gained in looking at another person or at images of other bodies. This pleasure is voyeuristic when it depends on an object of this gaze being unaware, not looking back. But voyeurism is originally a form of objectification with Freud saw as originating in childhood curiosity. At its extreme only, it becomes an obsessive sexual practice. So hidden behind the appreciation for stories or the aesthetic allure often reinforced by the seriality, scopophilia is one of the main pleasure triggers in attending performing arts as theater, dance, and above all, cinema. Voyeurism describes a way of looking that is related to the exercise of power in which a body becomes a spectacle for someone else's pleasure. And the concept of voyeurism is applicable not only to erotic images, but to any kind of representation, especially to bodies of knowledge. If within our voyeuristic analogy, we replace the human body with a body of knowledge, that is the accepted ontology for a specific domain, and we think about maps, and more in general, infographics, as the resulting fetishes, we can better frame it. The formal qualities of the projected image are the reassuring substitute object, which distract the spectator from the threat which that body of knowledge, with its complexity, depth, and shadows poses. And being distracted, we as spectators don't pursue our desire of knowing. Instead, we attend to the fetish, which operates as a delaying mechanism with respect to the fulfillment of our desire to know. but our irrational engagement with the fetish gives us pleasure and an illusion of power. The exercise of power is related to the objectification of the subject or theme of the representation. So by holding the infographics that I do every Saturday, Sunday in your hands, by owning that image and looking at it, we can control our information anxiety even before starting to interpret and absorb any layer of signification. In very simple terms, we experience this almost every day. Like when, for instance, just owning a map or a navigational tool or having it at hand makes traveling to and going across unknown places more comfortable for us. We ascribe to that particular object a special power, the ability to debunk the body of knowledge. We acquire a zenithal and detached perspectives that gives us control and a broad view over the represented subject, as with maps usually happens. The gaze becomes the view over, and the overview is one of the main functions of most data visualizations. But what happened? The author of that representation, we just saw that beautiful map from the 16th century, is expelled, is not present, is not there to look back at us. The author is not there. A graphic that is based on numbers, geometry, and visual perception gives the illusion of being fact-based, but it might not be. It dresses up as an objective and neutral representation, but is always the result of a narrowing analysis, targets that are deciding or communicating. It is partial view, a subjective grasping of the world as a picture. Similarly, the map enchants us with the illusion of representing the reality and plays this trick through the mechanism of projection. We are induced to believe that is neutral and objective, but is not. Let me tell you a story with regards to cutting in pieces and freezing a fragment of reality. Let me tell you a story about how maps work. And I mean how literally and ontologically they work. Maps are not created in the likeness of the world. On the contrary, it is rather the world, at least the modern world, and yet most of the contemporary one, that has been created in the likeness of the map. Look at the highways. Look at the buildings. Look out there. Straight lines do not belong to nature. A map is not just a plane, it is rather a plan. A call to action that always involves practices and visions imbued with relations of power and a certain amount of violence. Maps separate, tear apart, dissect and recompose. Maps seize and immobilize nature that is dynamic, fluent, constantly moving and growing, and turn it into something else that is still instead. And we have seen that in the first talk. That has its own unique and its fixed place, everything on the map. On the map, each element corresponds to one and only one place, and it has one and only one place name, for instance. The map obliterates any shifting and ambiguity. It flattens what is deep and stiffens not only the object, but also the language and its way to refer to the object. And in doing so, it paralyzes and expels the subject from the representation. The word map comes from the Latin mappam. It was originally derived from a Phoenician word to describe a mobile tablecloth, which each guest was used to bring over for dinner to cover the table and collect the leftover. Again, a concept originally linked to the table that can be the geographic grid, but also the anatomy table where the body of knowledge is fetishistically dissected and recomposed. As tools to collect leftovers, as mobile containers, maps work as our mental categories do, as finite sets which articulate our understanding of the world, turn its chaos and complexity into intelligible order, categorize objects and sense data, transform the Dionysiac into the Apollonian. But every visualization is a map, as it is a plan to map information to visuals. So, categories, maps, pieces of data visualization alike, pinpoint, separate, group, arrange, structure, filter, sort, project, and name things. The mechanics of mapping corresponds with our primordial way of thinking. And this is one of the reasons for which I think we should take maps and their progeny, infographics, more seriously. What we say about the power of mapping can be easily extended to the realm of infographics as a whole. But why? To answer the question, let's look at some facts. And we are going to talk also about the relations between infographics and facts in a few seconds. Clue number 1. Men have had the ability and the tendency to create graphic representation of various aspects of the world before they even started using alphabets. Maps were the first graphic treatment of information, and the oldest maps can be rightfully considered as the ancestral prototype of all infographics and data visualizations. Clue number 2. Jacques Bertin, in the 60s, was responsible for the biggest advancement in theoretical reflection on the graphic treatment of information. His attempt, the first and perhaps the only one so far, to develop a comprehensive theory of static graphic visualization has inspired some of the key figures in contemporary information graphics, such as Edward Taft, Bill Cleveland, and so on. Jacques Bertin was a theorist, but first and foremost, he was a cartographer. Clue number 3. The International Infographics Summit in Navarre, Spain, called Malofie, that many of you might have heard of, which has attracted the most authoritative experts and rewarded the best examples of infographics in the world in the last 20 years, is named after Alejandro Malofie. The Argentine was a journalist and an anarchist, but first and foremost, he was a cartographer. Clue number 4, the last one I promise, just to be very convincing. The first graphical treatment or representation of statistical data that we know of, that is the Lagrange's variations in the determination of longitude between Toledo and Rome from 1644, was trying to figure out how one of the Earth's dimensions could be rendered on maps. So apparently, cartography was also the subject of the first representation based on statistical data. According to these clues, it would be reasonable, considering the map as the mother of all the infographics. We can assume that maps represent a reference matrix, and that cartography, or mapping in broader terms, has created a fertile ground for the flourishing of techniques and frameworks of interpretation that can be at the base of today's reflection on infographics. Cartography, as an act of representing, uses a graphic code in making visible relations that would be difficult to be expressed in words immediately clear. And this is one of the unifying aspects in the field of mapping, despite all division and possible taxonomies. Many ideas about maps are applicable to infographics in general, and what Rudolf Arnheim said about visual media is applicable to maps and therefore to infographics. He said the principal virtue of the visual medium is that of representing shapes in two-dimensional and three-dimensional space as compared with a one-dimensional sequence of verbal language. And this polydimensional space, it also represents the dimensions needed for theoretical reasoning. While the use of natural language is a process that builds concepts by associating letters, sounds, and words, cartography, and we might say infographics in general, build bunches of relations and meanings, encoding data through visual and positional variables. The map doesn't work like a text. However, the two share a common basic, a semiotic function recalling the concept of semiosis as any action that designates meaning. Semiology, the disciplines that studies communications codes, but which also endeavors to describe and explain the structures of knowledge, states that knowledge brings into relation two universes, two separate sets of facts, one relating to reality and the other one to individual intentions. Any act of communication must connect the level of sensorial object with that of subjective intentions. The point of view creates the object. So in spite of belonging to linguistics, this expression also explains the limits of any map or infographic, which cannot be considered a model of truth unless it is put in relation with a subjective action on reality. Thus, we may come to the conclusion that cartography is a codified system of graphic communication. Hence, it has a semiotic function just like language. The ordering criterion in maps is the plane on which reality is reduced in relation to the will to analyze certain relationships. Thus, in fact, the relationship between verbal and cartographic languages raises a much wider range of theoretical issues. But what I would like to stress here is that the authors of graphic documents, by using a semiotic structure, a code, establish a one-to-one correspondence between signifiers and signifieds. A correspondence of this kind does not exist in natural language, which is ambiguous and always allows for a gap between signifier and signified. If we recognize the distinction between a syntactic and a semantic level in data visualization, we can move beyond fetish infographics. The syntactic level is where effective or ineffective data encodings operate. The semantic one is where honest or biased practices of data analysis and storytelling are unleashed. So, this is very important. We can have a graphic with truthful data, but wrong data encoding. We can have a graphic with biased and incomplete data, but effective encoding. And we can have graphics with biased data and wrong encoding. Or even graphics that encode effectively truthful data in ways that lead the user perception into, for instance, underestimating or overestimating the difference between values with or without an hidden agenda. Under no circumstances, a data visualization should be regarded as evidence. Then, what is the relationship between the data visualization, facts, data, and the truth? Let me answer this question by talking a little bit about one of the organizations I work for, the main one actually. Charles Prestwich Scott, the legendary editor of the Manchester Guardian from 1872 for 57 years, once wrote the notorious words that became the Guardian data blog slogan, "Comment is free, but facts are sacred." Data is at the core of the Guardian coverage, and it has been there since the very beginning, much earlier than WikiLeaks or the NSA files. The first issue ever of the Guardian's news coverage was dominated by a large and leaked table listing every school in Manchester with cost and pupils numbers. But what if Scott had been wrong and Cervantes' Don Quixote were right in saying to Dr. Carrasco that facts are the enemy of truth? Once again, the truth lies somewhere in the middle between a newsy and a fictional way to tell a story. Perhaps the truth emerges when we set a clear vision to set the facts with their proper weight and place, as facts are part of the truth, but not its whole. Facts can be the enemy of truth when they are not seen in proportion to the whole, and depth is missing from the picture. If data at its core is little more than aggregation of facts, we should rather say that sacred are the context and the insight we might be able to extract from it. I believe it is not completely by coincidence if the Guardian main motto is the whole picture. Indeed. It would be honestly difficult giving a better context to the facts are sacred statement. But in order to control the message and understand how data visualization plays its tricks and deals with facts, we need to equip ourselves with graphicacy. Graphicacy as a word that, how many of you have ever heard of the word graphicacy? One. Graphicacy as a word was proposed and introduced in 1965 by the English geographer William Balkin, or Balchin, for describing the educated counterpart of the visual spatial aspects of human intelligence and communication. Graphicacy was seen by Balchin as fundamental in education, along with literacy, numeracy, and articulacy. And since maps, diagrams, photography, and other spatial documents are the tools of graphicacy, as well as the basis of geography, Balchin argued that the skill of graphicacy was best imparted through geography. Graphicacy is defined as a form of visual spatial intelligence, as the ability to read a map, a graph, etc., or to present information by means of diagrams. It includes both the encoding skills and the decoding skills that we need to move beyond fetish infographics and beyond our fetishistic relationship with the infographics. Through graphicacy, we will understand whether the infographics work effectively or if some of them behave badly. Thanks to it, we will appreciate that bar charts need a base 0, always, so don't never do something like that without the base 0. Or why bars are better than pie charts in showing differences among the parts of a value, especially if the values are very close to each other. So evolution or revolution? In today's words, we experience data richness, or as we are often used to say, but I don't like it very much because it expresses a negative attitude. We suffer from information overload. This should not be considered as a limit or a threat. It is also and primarily a huge opportunity. We should stop relying on our fetish infographics to relieve the information anxiety produced by the ever-widening gap between what we understand and what we think we should understand. Let's face it, in the last 10 years, there have been dramatic advances in the ever-growing field of interactive data visualization. Data journalism is thriving, and infographics are everywhere. Higher processing power, new apps, web tools, programming languages, coding libraries, and social media platforms have facilitated the development of dataviz. However, at least two factors have radically changed the scenario. The scale of infographics popularity, which has expanded through what today is its main means of production and consumption, the internet, and the parallel democratization of information graphics in terms of use. Even so, an increasingly significant portion of the data visualization realm is becoming corporate, in-house oriented, and so-called B2B, business to business. On the other hand, it is indeed branching out from the narrow professional field to which it used to belong, allowing the bottom-up acquisition of the techniques and tools that regulate its production. But how and why is this change occurring? In what way does it relate to the spread of technologies and practices aimed at breathing new life into informed community participation, for instance? To what extent is the overlapping between user and authors of infographics part of the digital empowerment phenomena? These are all good questions. Despite all the fuss, the core principles of designing effective graphs to communicate data still provide a necessary foundation for any data visualization work and are more relevant than ever. Developing graphicacy means acquiring a basic knowledge of graphing techniques and enabling people to answer some fundamental questions like how to make effective and accurate graphs that improve understanding of data, how to avoid common problems that cause graphs to be ineffective, baffling, or even misleading, how to innovate and when to use new techniques to visualize data, how to be more critical and analytical when viewing graphs. We must go beyond fetish infographics and complete the transition from getting the whole picture to getting into the picture. That is the new motto. We have the opportunity to change and to embrace infographic activism, specifically target use of data visualization, in order to move from what the world conceived and grasped as a picture to a critical view of our active position in it. We should stop contemplating infographic in a fetishistic way and start making our own infographics instead. We should build our own picture of the world as it is, and why not, if we do it carefully, of the world as it should be. I'm aware this is a very controversial point, probably one of those strong statements that we're going to use in the spectrogram at the end of the conference. But honestly, in simple terms, it is just all down to a simple question. Can data visualization be used to extract insights and project them as a vision, as a plan, as a prescriptive and subjective recipe about how the world should be? I think this is part of the very and deep nature of data visualization. On the practical side of this mobilitization, the fact that we have a pencil on hand does not make us good illustrators. I know that there is a lot of emphasis on the tools. I teach data visualization at university. The first question that I get every time is, what about tools? But widespread access to computers that are connected to the web and thus make free visualizing application available does not per se generate an army of talented visual editors. Creating content visually, it's fun, but it's also hard work, requires competence and takes time. The popularization of instruments should always come with the acquisition of principles and methods which remain valid independently of the technological context or specific software in use. Attention should be paid to semantics, that is the care for the visualized content, and syntax, selection and articulation of the graphics forms for representation. That is, paying attention to the elements of the generative grammar supporting data visualization as a language. The shift from data to graphically visualized information that occurs in visual encoding should adhere to a method that includes research, analysis, planning, design, implementation, validation, and the iteration of all of them. The forms chosen to represent data will then depend only on the type of data and on the need to express in graphic terms one or more aspects of its behavior. Content will be analyzed, selected and distilled into graphic elements in which every sign has possibly a meaning and a reason to be, with little margin for the superfluous. A quality criterion that is to evaluate the respect of these principles and the ability to effectively convey information and knowledge must be based on infographics compliance to the method and on the visualization results in terms of graphic effectiveness. Obviously, this is not the only possible way to go. In fact, within the communication balance, this criterion attributes more importance to the people infographics are destined to, as it ascertains the representation quality according to its ability to tell a story and convey a message to the recipient. However, in infographics, there is an intrinsic quality that does not depend on the result of visualization, but which lies in the discipline's usefulness as a precipitation of the cognitive process. As a matter of fact, infographics are useful to those who read their output, but even more so to those who create them. Indeed, it is their creation that perhaps is the most important and powerful aspects of their use. As a data visualization is developed, before maker and user are even put into relation, the infographic gives structure to what its author knows or will be knowing. On closer inspection, infographics does not work like a simple communication tool. Instead of merely transmitting a piece of information, it is able to lead from a virtual problem to an actual double act of comprehension, first for the author and then for the reader. We must go beyond fetish infographics and move toward what I like to call civic infographics, contributing to the advancement of an informed society and promoting the critical development of a point of view on themes that regard us all. These are the primary goals that motivate civic infographics and that provide infographics with a final quality evaluation that goes beyond the result achieved with visualization. Recalled by the adjective civic, this quality does not lie only in the results, but is inscribed in the goals of graphic narration. That means doing good with data. Civic infographics are participative. They highlight urgent and relevant issues, interpreting and describing with the power of graphic experience, with the aim of showing that problems are not one next to the other, like on a map, distant, but one inside the other, in a web of complex relations. Civic infographics use the language of graphics to create a scandal, taking the word for its original etymology, to reawaken the critical awareness in the civitas. Thus, infographics become the scandalon, originally the stumbling block, in which the solidity of data meets clarity of form on the path to comprehending complexity. The scandalo gives us a jolt and reawakens our attention. It makes us pause and reflect upon complexity. It reminds us that reality is not a monolithic block, but still and more than ever the realm of recursion. Civic infographics resort to the overlapping of science and the logic of mapping to bring out one of the word fragments and project it on the plane of representation, forcing us to slow down and give due time to every effort to understand, which is our civic and cultural commitment. Thank you very much.